You're tuning in to WellFound's Ask a Recruiter, where we sit down with recruiters to share their advice on the hiring process. Hi everyone, welcome to today's Ask a Recruiter session. I'm joined by Em Rhodenbaugh, a technical recruiting leader with over 13 years of experience in the tech industry. Em has built and scaled teams at Google, Airbnb, Reddit, and numerous startups. She successfully grew Airbnb's product organization from 12 to over 100 product managers and helped establish their team in China. Em specializes in technical leadership recruiting across engineering, product, and design. Today, we'll be diving into our topic, from Google to startups, how hiring differs across the tech ecosystem. We'll explore the unique challenges, opportunities, and strategies for candidates navigating different company environments, which Em knows so well. Thank you so much for joining us, Em.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Awesome. I'm really excited to get into these questions. So the first question that we have is about comparing startups and established companies. So you've worked at Google, Airbnb, Reddit, and startups. How do the fundamental hiring philosophies differ across these environments, and what surprised you most about these differences?
That's a really interesting question. I think that before I started working within the tech sphere, I also worked at some recruiting agencies. So I've got some experience across the board. And I feel really grateful that I was able to join Google when I did in my career, because it was a great training ground. I don't know if folks know, but Google does a lot of people analytics works, which then goes into trainings, peer-to-peer trainings. And they've even open sourced a lot of this work under Google Rework. You can go visit and find out information about scaling and building really strong technical teams. So at Google, I really learned the fundamentals of recruiting for technical teams, primarily engineering. And then I branched out into other areas when I went to Nest, which was a newly acquired company by Google. But that was the first experience I had recruiting for technical teams at Google. And it only grew from there. I knew leaving Google that I was going to look for an earlier stage company. And I still remember the day vividly that I accepted the offer with Airbnb. I was thinking there's no way that I was going to be able to work at Google, one of the best companies in the world, get my top choice for my next role, which was working at Airbnb. And it happened. And so that helped shaped my understanding of helping scale and build exceptionally performing teams. It gave me some insight into what I was looking for personally, and then how I could be really effective at scaling and building strong organizations. I think the environments particularly are really important, because I have a fundamental belief that anyone can be successful, but it's largely dependent on their environment. And so while someone could be successful at Google, they might not be as successful at an earlier stage startup, and vice versa. And I think that as a new college grad, you're getting out of school and you're thinking like, where do I go? What do I do next? Or even mid-level, you've worked for 5 to 10 years, and now you're like, well, what's best for me? And so there's a lot of different directions to go in. I like the try it method, where you learn about it through actually being in the organization. But not everybody likes that and wants to be a little bit more predictive about where they're going. And so as you can imagine, there's vast differences in environments. Google is going to be highly structured. Your role is going to be highly structured. The career ladders, Google coined these terms. These are highly structured. And then a startup may not have, they're not going to probably have career titles or career ladders or any structure. Maybe you might be going in and having to build that structure yourself. So it takes a pretty strong understanding of, what drives you, and then what environment is going to be best for you, dependent on these different types of companies.
Awesome. That's really helpful to hear about, and sort of really paints a picture of the differences that you might see. And it leads kind of well into the next question, which is about how the interview process may differ between a tech giant like Google and an early stage startup. And so I think, with that in mind, if you're giving advice to a candidate, they're going in for an interview at Google, what might you tell them about, or how would you inform them on what research to do before going into that interview? And how might that differ from a startup, or what maybe should they be showcasing for each?
I think that is something that a lot of people are probably thinking about as they're trying to decide what environment is great for them. Is really importantly, how do I get into that environment? And interview preparation is extremely important. As you can imagine, it's very different from organization to organization. Again, Google has done a lot of really cool research about what on the job success looks like, and they've linked that back to their interviews and created a lot of success hiring high performing teams. So I like to take that as like the standardized example. And then thinking about different interview processes that I've been a part of, they range from like a laissez-faire approach is what I call, where they're like, tell me about yourself. Do you have any questions for me? And some people may not even ask you any questions about yourself. So preparing for that interview and preparing for a Google interview are going to be very separate. Separate processes and experiences. As a recruiter, one of the very, very, very few things that I can influence is candidate preparation. I can understand what is happening in the interview process. I can share that information with candidates, and I can also share different relevant materials for prepping folks. And for Google, I think this is no secret. It's leak code. It's a lot of algorithms. It's a lot of like, you need a CS degree to really knock this out of the ballpark. And then for earlier stage startups, I'm noticing that there's a little bit of a trend to go more applied. So putting candidates through an experience where it might replicate on the job scenarios that you would encounter, and then watching how the candidate problem solves through that. So maybe there's not a right answer. It's a scenario based question. We're just looking for how you're going to perform during that question. And so interview preparation is very different for both of those interviews. I can think of one example most recently where this came into play, and I think this is going to be relevant for almost all job seekers out there, which is a code signal. So I was recently working with a company that was using code signal as a tool to automate their interviewing process, particularly their technical coding interview. And those not familiar with code signal is essentially you get a link, you go in and you solve some coding problems in real time. It's generally time capped, so you have a certain amount of time to complete the interviews, and there's a score. Generally it's out of 600, and you have to do X well enough, score a score of X to be able to get to the next level. And I noticed just a super, super high failure rate amongst candidates. And one of the things that I was hearing, so I was asking for feedback from the candidates when I let them know we weren't moving forward because they didn't score high enough. One of the big pieces of feedback we got was that candidates were not familiar with the platform. And so even one candidate had told me that they had to update their Chrome browser in the middle of this time stamped interview, which then led them not to have enough time to finish the problem. And so immediately I started thinking about this. When I was at Google, I would send them Euler leak code problems to solve, and everyone kind of knows about these questions. But one of the things that I realized I needed to start sharing with people is they needed to familiarize themselves with the platform. That was going to be first and very important for them to do well on this coding challenge, which wasn't something I thought of immediately about why people might not be doing very well. But it really was a huge game changer. I started sharing not just familiarizing yourself with the platform, but also here's some test questions that you should definitely take that Code Signal actually provides, so that you're able, when you start this, you are prepared and ready to go. It makes me think about school. No one ever wants to go in to take a test where you don't know what you're going to be evaluated on. So it's really important for a recruiter to be able to prep that candidate. Well, first understand what the evaluation criteria looks like, and then prep the candidate so they can be most successful.
Oh, that's awesome. And I think that it's something that a lot of candidates even miss, that a recruiter is really there for that reason, to like answer those questions and help you be successful. They're on your side. I love it when recruiters give us that little insight into how they're trying to help. The next question that I have here is, what types of candidates tend to thrive in startup environments versus established tech companies? I'm sure you have a really good insight into kind of the differences in personality types, work culture, slants, and things like that. And how can job seekers evaluate where they may fit best?
I'm giggling a little bit because I'm going to share a little insider, early Airbnb kind of insider scoop. Many folks know the VP of product, Joe Zade. We call him Joe Bot is our name for him. I mean, everything's Joe Bot. His email address. I never even knew that his name was not Joe Bot until a couple of months into my tenure at Airbnb. So I had to partner with Joe to, we had like, a small product team, and we needed to grow the product team pretty dramatically. So we had to build, a scalable interview process, but we first had to build career ladders to find out how people were going to be successful on the job. A lot of really fun process adventures to get to a scalable process. And through that journey, JoeBot made it really, really easy for the team because he said, we need to hire people that are entrepreneurs at heart. We're hiring many CEOs, and ideally, these candidates have 5 years of experience and have started a company. That's who we were looking for. That was our profile, which was a really interesting profile and led to a really fascinating culture because we were able to successfully hire folks. The insider scoop part of this is he also said, I want them drinking from the trough of sorrows. And I'll never forget this because it is a really wonderful way to talk about how growth mindset works, which is you try to do something. And as an entrepreneur, generally that's for the first time. You're doing it for the first time. The world may be getting this for the first time. And the likelihood of failure is very high. And so we're looking for someone that's going to be super resilient in the face of failure. And then they're going to be able to start over. And they're going to be able to create something new. And they're going to continue doing that until they have success. And I think ultimately this is what we're looking for with entrepreneurs and early stage startups. So it was a really cool, interesting experiment. I'll call it an experiment to see is this going to work. It did work. About who was going to work well from startups. And so we started out with that basic premise and then built the process from there. But surprisingly, I saw a statistic recently that Airbnb has the top 10 out of startup executives right now, startup founders. Airbnb ranks in the top 10 of folks that have left Airbnb and have gone on to found their own company. Many of them had done that before, and then they were leaving to go on and do it again. But that's ultimately what I found. This was pretty early in my career. And so when I was working with startups, that's something that we were able to incorporate into the process, namely for leadership and product managers, folks that were having a wide breadth of collaboration within an organization and really helping drive that product feature and future for the company. We really wanted folks that were entrepreneurial and had a strong growth mindset, meaning that you were able to learn from your mistakes and correct them and try again and eventually get to that success.
Oh, yeah. I feel like resilience is a top trait for sure. Awesome. Yeah, I love that antidote, and hearing about that history of Airbnb is really interesting. This question is a little bit more pragmatic, and I think it's also something that people don't have, maybe don't talk about always openly, so talk about as much as you can. But how do compensation packages typically differ between established tech giants and startups? And also, what hidden factors should candidates consider when they're evaluating offers?
This is something that's changing constantly. When I was thinking about compensation, I think about it all the time because it's probably top three, if not the top reason candidates are going to accept or decline an offer. So it's a big part of that decision-making process. And when you have, when we're talking about companies like Reddit or Google or Airbnb, even some earlier stage companies, getting to the compensation discussion, like you're going to probably have other offers when you're talking about this. And that's a important piece of this as well. When I was at Google, this was a long time ago, mind you, circa 2015, Google didn't value startup equity. So when we were interviewing a candidate, we got to the final stages, we wanted to make them an offer. We have salary bands, which I can go into great detail about how these are created. We have these salary bands, low point and a high point. candidate falls somewhere in there. The way that that's determined is generally from interview performance and then scope of the role. How will they be contributing to the team? And then, it comes down to, do you have competing offers, or how much equity are you leaving on the table? And at Google at that point, they were not valuing equity from startups because it wasn't liquid. The failure rate for startups is 97% or 98%. It might be higher now. So the likelihood of that equity coming to fruition from a Google standpoint was not likely. From a candidate standpoint, they were optimistic that they were going to, not just optimistic, but they felt almost like that money was in hand and that they were losing out if they were going to be leaving equity on the table, if they were going to be leaving before their final vest, or if they had a competing offer with a startup that had an equity component. So the way in which compensation packages differ, I think the main point is going to be equity. When you have a public company, the equity is liquid. You're going to have to pay short-term capital gains if you sell it before a year of vesting, but definitely consult an accountant on that topic of short-term capital gains. But long story short, equity is going to be the biggest piece because it is not generally going to be liquid at a startup. And so you have to think about what that means in the short term for you and your family as a candidate. Not have this liquid equity for the next couple of years. For me personally, Airbnb went public 5 years after I left. So I invested equity. We didn't know what was going to happen. The pandemic hit. The hospitality industry got hit like unbelievably hard. And then Airbnb went public in December of 2020. So it was kind of everything about it was very risky, but it ended up paying off pretty dramatically. I feel like all my stories are like this. Reddit is another example of when I was at Reddit in 2021. I joined and the company immediately became a $15 billion company based on a recent round of investing. And then just 4 months later, Fidelity downgraded it to 3.5 billion. And so you never know what equity is going to do, but it ended up paying out really, really strongly for both of those examples. So I think those are good examples of how if you can withstand long-term compensation impacts, i.e., you may not be able to liquidate your equity for 5 or 10. Oftentimes there's clauses for the equity to expire after 7 years. That's something important to look at when you're a candidate. Mm-hmm. How long will I have my equity after it's vested and after I leave the company? Or if you have options, do I have to purchase these shares to own them? Mm-hmm. At what point do I do that? So there's a lot more. Risk involved with a startup. I would say from personal experience, though, the payout is priceless, i.e. day to day, what you're doing at a startup is very different than what you're doing at a public company. At startups, you're trying new things, you're inventing new things, you're probably the only person at the company that does what you do. At a larger, later stage company, public company, you're going to be a little bit more beholden to that bottom line. And how can I maximize my time to be impactful of that bottom line? So you're thinking about different things. Again, some people really like that and thrive in those big company, highly structured environments. And some folks really thrive in that day-to-day of an early stage or an earlier stage company where you can do a lot of different things.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So you're not just comparing your compensation, but what is your experience going to be like? What really suits you? And I think it's so important to talk about equity because it's confusing to people, even what questions to ask about what's the brass tacks of how that's going to work. Wonderful points. So for a Google or Meta engineer looking to join a Series A startup, what's the biggest adjustment they need to make in how they present themselves and approach the interview? So it doesn't have to be Google or Meta, but someone who is used to working in that kind of environment. What's the big change and why maybe would they even do it? What are they going to get out of the experience?
I think that's such an important question that we are constantly asking ourselves and that is asked early in the interview process. You're coming from Google, you're coming from Meta, you're coming from Amazon, you're coming from Fang. Why would you want to join an early stage? What are the trade-offs that you're thinking about and why would you want to do this? And I think for exceptionally, I think there's something in common with FANG engineers in particular, is that they are exceptional. They are very good. They are the best of the best. And so oftentimes these smart people want to solve hard, complex problems that don't exist at Meta and Google. They only exist at these early stage startups. And oftentimes, if a startup's good and they've got strong product market fit, it's because the product doesn't exist already. So instead of adding features or fine tuning something else, then you can go and own the building of a new product from 0 to 1. It's Series A. They probably don't have product market fit. It's probably theoretical. It's probably an idea in their head at this point, and you're being brought on to actually have that rubber meet the road and build the product and think through all the things that you need to think through, from infrastructure, front end, back end, generative AI. How does this work with what we're trying to achieve? What is that end goal? And that exploration process for a lot of people is really exciting. And I think that if we all ask ourselves, and we're all, authentic, I think we all like that. We all thrive on complex problem solving and get excited about creating new things. I think the piece, though, that holds people back is that risk factor. I've got a family of 5. We're living in the Bay Area. I won't have equity for 5, 10, 15 years. Can I do that? It's a risky move. And so I understand why it's not right for everybody. But if you've got a chance to do it, I highly recommend it. It's exciting. And then it also helps you build a stronger sense of self when you're in it and you're working hard to achieve complex problems. It's an emotional challenge too. You get attached to it. The people working with you become very connected and dependent upon them. So it creates these really cool familial-like environments, which I like. You can tell I get excited when I talk about early stage startups. They're exciting places to be, and the sky's the limit, and there's a lot of opportunity that doesn't exist oftentimes in larger companies.
Oh yeah, that resonates with me, this idea of kind of working with conviction and getting attached to the product in this way that is really unique when you are building it from the ground up. And it leads really nicely into my next question, because it's a little bit about risk. There is some risk in applying and sussing out a startup that you are interested in working for. And hopefully you're going into those situations with some choice. So one question is, what are some of the warning signs that candidates should watch for during interviews? I guess at both startups and big tech, but I think it applies a little bit more to startups just because of that early stage setting. And then conversely, what might be positive signals? Like what could indicate a healthy organization as well?
This is so important, and it's very individual. So I can give you my biased, what I look for, what my flags are, what recommendations I would have for people. So take it with a grain of salt. We all have our biases, and I certainly do. But some of the things that are really important to me is the team, the day-to-day. I want to know who I'm working with. I want a courageous team. I want a generous, kind team where I can be my best self. And at this point in my career, I'm fortunate enough to know what that looks like. And so I expect that from my workplace. And then the next piece that's really important to you is going to be that product market fit. So you're going to work well with the team. Are these people you're going to have to work really hard with? So you want to make sure that the right people, that you're aligned, your morals and your values are aligned. I feel like a dating coach right now. You have to find out what their values are and then share your values and get vulnerable. But then also really dive into that product. What is the product? What is the vision? At an earlier stage company, as I mentioned, you might not have a whole lot to go on. It might be very theoretical at this point. And then you're going to want to understand what the market opportunity is, what the historical growth trajectory has been. As you get into later stage companies, especially Series B and Series C, you're going to be able to ask these questions. A common question I want to know from any company is, what is your revenue? From a consumer-based company, what's that revenue? From an enterprise-based company, what is your ARR? I want to know what's happening with the business. I would love to know historical information. What does the growth trajectory look like? What's impacted the growth trajectory? And then what is that future market opportunity? These are not complex questions that, you need an economics degree to understand, or you need to have worked at McKinsey to be able to understand the health of the business. These are just a couple of indicators that VCs use as they're evaluating companies. And you can even look at what VCs use and ask about that too. For certain industries, daily active users, monthly active users are going to be really important. For other industries, revenue, as I mentioned, is going to be really important as an indicator to understand the health and welfare of the business. And then understanding the product too. Does the product resonate with you? First of all, do you understand it? I've talked to a ton of Series A founders where they tell me about their product. And in my head, I'm thinking either I have no idea what you're talking about. It doesn't make any sense to me. Could be for a variety of reasons. Namely, it's technical and I don't understand the problem they're trying to solve. Or I do understand the problem they're going to solve and it doesn't seem like a problem that needs solving. So I'm thinking in my head, there isn't a market opportunity for this thing that you have this idea for. Certainly wouldn't probably say that to somebody. But I can think that and I can use that as an evaluation criteria. Or sometimes like, oh, this is a great example. When Airbnb was founded, this is kind of a famous story. When Airbnb was founded, Joe and Brian thought that this would just be for conferences. It started a design conference and then it was at the Democratic National Convention in Denver. They were placing people in homes. And then someone reached out to them afterwards and were like, hey, I'm going to be traveling to this location. Do you have any hosts in this place? And they were like, we don't, what are you traveling for? There's no convention. There's no event that you're traveling for. And that kind of blew the lid off. They're like, oh, we can do this when there's not events too. So maybe you talk to someone and they've got a good idea. Airbnb had a good idea and it resonated with you. And then you come on board and you're like, I've been talking to the customers. This is what the customers have been saying. So having a good understanding too of the role that you can play in shaping the future of that product. Another great example of why it's so fun to join an early stage company, because you can be on that ground floor of helping shape the future of that product. And certainly as more data points come in, that's helpful. But initially, those are the things that I look at that are really important. I have a friend recently that resigned from his engineering leadership position because the founder started doing kind of bizarre things in meetings. He would ask about familial trauma in the workplace and just really, really bizarre behavior. These are things that you don't know when you're interviewing unless they do it in the interview. And I'd hope they would do it in the interview so that you would know beforehand. But there's a lot of things that people don't do in interviews and you don't know. And so it's hard to find out after you've already maybe resigned from your other job and now you're dependent on this new job and you got to get another job before you leave this new job where there's a problem. But ideally, you're able to find those personality differences and commonalities too. Can I work with this person? Which generally, I think happens. I think we see a lot of really cool collaboration.
Awesome. Yeah, I think a lot of candidates don't even realize that they should be asking questions to try to figure out some of the answers to these problems that you're talking about. And it's really good to have that call to action and like reminder of how important it can be. Because it's, takes a lot of effort to onboard to a company and you want to make sure it's going to be a good fit, hopefully. So those are great things to outline for people to be watching out for and asking questions about. My next question is about scaling, like your experience at Airbnb, scaling the product team from 12 to over 100 product managers, which is a huge feat and very impressive. I wonder about like, how did your hiring approach evolve as the company grew? And also like, if there's any takeaways for candidates to consider, growing or applying to a company that is growing that quickly.
Airbnb is a unique example. And I'll say this primarily because Airbnb is known for having a high bar for culture. And I almost hesitate to use the word culture because that means so many different things to so many different people. And in the interview process, you want to avoid any ambiguity. You want things to be clear. You want clear evaluation criteria. You want alignment from interviewers. And what Airbnb did that was really cool was they created what they call culture interviews. And they spent over a year working on this, really deep diving into what are the attributes and values of the company that we want our employees to have. They quantified those. And then they built evaluation criteria and training criteria and reverse training and continue to evolve and build upon that. So in addition to the hard skills interviews that you got at Airbnb, you also got 2 culture values interviews. And so that led to creating a team that adhered to a very strong value set, which was really, really cool. It also gave us a lot of clarity around what was important on the job, which again, Google did this very, very well, which is, what does on the job success look like? How do we build that into the interview process? So everybody succeeds, when we get to the point of evaluation, on the job performance evaluation. And so for candidates, I think the important part is to understand your own value set and your own desires and your own drivers to success. How are you going to be most successful? And then understanding how that aligns with the company. So thinking about how we scaled interviewing, particularly for product and growing the teams in this way, there were a lot of leadership, a lot of folks in leadership. We decentralized the organization, which really helped us to hire for specific teams. I think that's something that was really helpful for candidates to understand, is who are the decision makers in the interview process and what are they looking for? Again, going back to JoBot, and I don't like secret interviews. Like, you're going to meet with the VP of product, but I'm not going to tell you what's going to happen. That would be terrifying, I would think. For JoBot, growth mindset was really, really important. He wanted folks on the team that had growth mindset. So he would ask candidates about it. And the way that we would ask candidates is we would say, hey, tell us about a most recent product launch that didn't go well, went really bad. Like, what happened? And so we would get the candidate response, and then he would say, what would you have done differently? And so he used that as litmus to understand, can they be successful in a highly entrepreneurial environment? Can they be successful in an environment where you're failing most of the time? Are you going to be able to get back up and succeed in this type of environment? And that's a cool testament to, we really understood what we needed. And then we were pretty clear with folks about, hey, this is what we're looking for. So when I would prep candidates, I would say, hey, you're going to meet with Joe. This is the format of how everything's going to work. And then this is what you're going to talk about. You're going to talk about growth mindset. So those are all, I think, important tools. It's namely going to be, what is the decision maker making the decision? In an early stage startup, it's like you have a founder and maybe an engineer, and that's it. So they're all doing all the interviews. And so it's really important to understand how they're evaluating candidates and then sharing that information as a recruiter with those candidates. Oftentimes these early stage startups are doing their own recruiting. And so they don't have a good structured understanding of how recruiting works, or it's almost how to make candidates feel a little bit more comfortable and set them up for success. I've run into a lot of founders that are like, oh no, we can't tell anybody what's going to happen in the interview because then they'll know the questions. Which, it gives me a little laugh, especially for system design interviews, because a system design interview is generally like, tell me about a system you've designed, and then they design it for you. Or, here, let me give you some parameters, design this system. Like, this is not like you need, it's based on previous experience, long story short. So you don't, if you're telling someone it's a system design interview, you're not giving away the question. But I always find it a little bit funny, and I'm happy to do education with leaders and hiring managers that I partner with, so that we can all create successful, transparent processes for candidates. But I'll just say it one more time. It's really important for candidates to understand how the decision makers are making their decision, so that they can show up appropriately. I will mention that one of the things that I see with candidates that have been at larger companies, especially for a longer period of time, the hiring managers and the interviewers are going to come in highly skeptical that they're going to be successful in a startup environment. And so it's really important for, I don't know why this happens, but it almost feels like a humility. Like, I worked at Oracle for 10 years, so I already know everything. You're not going to teach me anything. So it's really important for people to go in with like an open mind and really have that humility and openness to hear what's happening in the interview, so that you can set yourself up for success.
Oh, that makes so much sense. I think that's a really good thing to remind people about. And also, I think this is a really good reflection on what early stage startups should be focusing on if they're doing their own hiring to make those parameters clear. I feel like that's a point that gets missed sometimes. So, really helpful. One question that I feel like is actually really relevant right now, especially as AI is sort of ramping up people's ability to do different technical things, is what kind of soft skills have become increasingly important to startups that might not be as critical at larger companies or vice versa. You just mentioned a really good one, which is humility, actually.
The skill set is changing, compensation's changing, skill set's changing, everything's changing. And the rate of change is also, as we all know, it's increasing. And so some of the things that when I was at Airbnb, the engineering team changed from mobile native to over to React. React was brand new. And when I got to Quizlet, which was the next company I worked at after Airbnb, the engineering team was thinking of switching over to React as well. And at Airbnb, they had switched over and then they had reverted back. And so that engineering team wanted to know why this happened. And so that's a great example of like real-time skill set. I mean, React is pretty synonymous now. I haven't come across like a native mobile engineering role in a little while. So that's just one example of how things are changing. So the skill sets are changing in a big way, and AI is impacting that dramatically. And it's really cool to see companies embracing AI. It's always interesting because some companies are like, no AI. And I have a lot of questions about that. And some companies are like, only use AI, which to me makes a lot of sense because it does a lot of the work that I don't do as well. And so it helps me be a better all around employee when I use AI. And so when I think about that, it's just changed the landscape of how, let's just use software engineers, for example. That's how software engineers work. Their entire work structure is changing. It's changing constantly. And so that's something I see also with larger companies. So you've worked at a larger company and you may be coding in C++. This was common at Google when I was there. They only were really hiring folks for C++ or Java. I don't even think they had an iOS native app. Maybe they had started it, long story short. Now all of that has already changed. And that's just been 10 years ago. So we're already seeing those pretty massive changes. And from a skill set level, I'm no expert here. I'm no technical expert, but what I do know is that the skills in coding languages especially are really interesting and hard to come by. So we see a lot of startup founders as of like last year, a lot of people, especially in the Web3 blockchain industry, are asking for Rust coding experience. Well, Rust has only been around for a year and a half, 2 years. So you've got now all of these startup founders that are like, we're coding in Rust, we're doing this all in Rust, so we need Rust engineers. Well, you've just shortened your pool to whatever. You need all these requirements plus Rust. There's 600 people in the world that are qualified for your job. So that's something to think about too, is like, as an engineer, what are the things that are going to make you more marketable, and what are the coding languages? I sadly see, this is super anecdotal, I don't have any data points, but I sadly see a lot of people that identify as Java engineers. For me personally, I haven't hired for a role that codes in Java for 10 years. So I don't know where these Java engineers are going or where they came from or where they're going to next. But it just doesn't feel like there's a huge market for that right now. Again, completely anecdotal. I just think that there's a lot more cool stuff out there. I worked at a company last year, a really cool company. And one of the hiring managers would ask all the candidates something that they've learned new in the last 12 months. And I really like that question because it shows that you're constantly learning, and that you're curious. And I think curiosity creates a lot of on-the-job success. You've got a problem to solve and you've got to figure out, be resourceful in how to solve that problem. So that ultimately might be the solution, is just be curious. What's going on out there? Because it's going to be changing. It's going to be in constant motion.
Yeah, I love that. My next question was like about marketable skills and like things like anticipatory moves that candidates can make, but you kind of outlined that already. And curiosity and, just staying on top of what might be worth upskilling makes a lot of sense to me. And you already kind of outlined, about how resilience is a really important thing to showcase, and humility. And I love all of those as encapsulation of what might be great to showcase in an interview. I guess the next question I had is really just like a hot take question. So I just wonder if you could give me a hot take on what candidates are doing wrong in their applications, especially because you review a lot and or their online presence. And what is one thing you just really wish candidates knew and why? Like something that is like a takeaway for them that you want to distill.
Oh, there's so many hot takes.
You can
I'm looking at resumes all day. And so my brain is trained to look for the requirements of the role. And oftentimes I'll just keep using engineering as an example because it's pretty ubiquitous versus product and data science and design, which are a little bit more subjective on that evaluation scale. So for engineering, for example, I need to know you have the skills relevant for the job. And the information I generally have is these are the technical pieces that we're using. For the team, I generally know what the team gaps are. We've got 6 brand new grads and we need a team lead, or we have no one on the team and we need a founding engineer. And this is the framework that we're using to build the product. So generally I'm looking for those pieces of information combined with years of experience. And then I also want to know, like, do you have a CS degree or not? Where did you get it? And I'm using all this information to sort of build into, does this person meet the requirements? So if you include a lot more information than that, that's not relevant to any of that, it's going to be really hard for me or anyone to see if you're qualified for the job or not. And I think in the absence of being able to see that information, most people are just going to say, we're going to pass. Or if you include, like, say I need a Python engineer, which is a very popular coding language, and you include Python, but then you also include 20 other coding languages, I'm going to be a little bit skeptical that you are primarily coding in Python and that you're going to be able to jump in and effectively hit the ground running. So those are some pieces that I think about. And then something that's been coming up a little bit more recently is when I keep saying we want entrepreneurial folks on the team, but when someone has a resume, and I just looked at one this morning, and I was like, I can't tell what's going on here. It's when you have a job, but then at the same time, you have like 6 other jobs. You're also a board member. You also have a side hustle where you founded a company, and you're also in school full time, and you're also doing this, and you've got all these things. It again makes me very skeptical that you're going to have the time and the ability to be able to concentrate on this one thing that you need to do. It's hard, right? Because I'm like, I need an entrepreneur. And the entrepreneur is like, yeah, I'm an entrepreneur. I've got all these side hustles. That's how this works. It's pretty hard to then be like, but do you have time for this job? And I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt that that's something that founders are really looking at. And so I remember being in college and being like, I have my internship. I can't wait to add this. And I'm going to add that I did this. And I was a volunteer here. And I'm going to add that. And it's going to show, I don't know what it's going to show, but I remember building my resume in that way. Well, now that we're mid to late in our career, we're thinking about, like, how can I be really concise and articulate and clear about what it is that I'm doing so that I can demonstrate that I'm qualified for this job pretty easily, make it easy for someone to see that. As far as online presence, though, I think we're all still using LinkedIn. Is that still happening? It seems like a popular place. I understand, though, that, like, if folks don't want to get reached out to or pestered or bothered, so maybe you leave LinkedIn and then you want to be a little bit more diligent about your search. I would recommend that when you are looking for a role, it creates a little bit of a data gap. I don't know. It's probably just my bias kicking in, but when I see a candidate that doesn't have a LinkedIn profile, it doesn't make it feel like they're a real candidate. Again, totally my bias, and I understand why people take their LinkedIn profiles down and why they put them up and why they change them. Makes a lot of sense. But I do recommend, if you are looking for a new role, even if you're being highly targeted, that you have a LinkedIn profile that's up to date. Again, that's clearly articulating what it is you're doing and probably what you're looking for at that point.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We did a profile kind of critique and like resume critique last week with some candidates, and a lot of them had a problem with exactly what you're talking about, like keeping it concise and what I was referring to as killing your darlings, taking off those things that maybe you're really proud of, but they kind of diffuse the focus of what you're really looking for, how you really want to fit into your next role. So I think people get attached to these histories that kind of frame who they are. I have one last question, which is a bit of a fun question. And I'm starting to get in the habit of asking all recruiters this. What is your favorite interview question to ask and why?
My favorite question is, what do you want to do next? What would be like the ideal thing for you to do? And people always go, do you mean for work? Which I respond, maybe not necessarily. Like, is there something else you want to be doing right now? I'm all ears. I want to have that conversation because what generally, as an in-house recruiter, what I generally have is that knowledge about the team and the team gaps and the team dynamics and what they're doing and what their needs are. And so if I get someone that's like, my partner is going to have quadruplets next week, and so we're busy with having all these kids, and then I've got the hiring manager that's like, we got to do 2-week sprints until the end of the year and no one's taking any time off. Like, that's not going to be the right job for that person. And so I always think about those pieces that I can help add and help illustrate for folks based on my knowledge of what's happening on the teams. But one of the reasons I love recruiting is because I love to ask people what they want to do. I like to find out what people's jobs are. It's so cool. I get to find out what people do. I get to see what success looks like. I get to see how people thrive. Like, hey, I'm obsessed with numbers. I love RevOps. Like, let's go, let's tango. You want to see my keyboard shortcuts? That brings me a lot of joy. So I really like to find out what people like to do and what drives them. I most of the time get very boring answers. There's not any like recently where I've been like inspired to like change my life, which that would be cool if that happened. It generally happens with leadership candidates, more folks that have been in their career for a little bit longer. I see them being a lot more animated about what drives them and what makes them happy. I've worked with some really interesting people. I haven't gotten this information from interviews, but having worked with people in different fields, it's always interesting to see, what hobbies folks have outside of the workplace. I've worked with people that are highly technical, that are painters in their free time, lots of pilots, lots of, people doing really fascinating stuff, which, makes me excited about the world too, and want to try these new things that other people are trying.
Yeah, I love that. It seems like you have a deep passion for getting to know people and seeing where they thrive, and it all kind of aligns around that. I think that's a really wonderful part about recruiting and just helping people find jobs in general. Very cool. Thank you so much for all of your insights. This was wonderful. There's so many things that I learned and that I'm excited to share with our community. I know that they're going to just eat this up. So I really appreciate you spending the time with us and helping our well-found community.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. So fun to go through these questions with you.
Ready to find your next role or discover top talent? Visit us at wellfound.com.